Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Weekly Coder. I'm Chris, and this week we're gonna continue working on our Minesweeper. We are now on part 2. Part 1 was pretty basic. Part 2 is probably gonna be pretty basic. As you'll remember from part 1, what we did is we created this game script, and in that script, all we really did here is we generated, basically we created a for loop that ran 10 times because we needed 10 mines. And the place mines method basically gets a random x and y for every time it runs. It also checks to make sure that that x and y hasn't been used previously. And if it has, then we run it again until we find one that hasn't. So, what we're going to do in this episode is we are going to add some sprites to represent these game objects that we're creating. Because as you'll remember, we are creating game objects, and that's because we needed to add this game object as a game object in our grid array, which may not make much sense yet, but it will, I promise, as we continue on down this road. It'll start making sense. So for now, let's go ahead and just let's get out of Visual Studio for a second and go back into... why is this window here? Okay, I'll just move that over here then. So let's get back into Unity for a second, because we're going to have to create a few folders. And to start with, we're going to create the resources folder, because that folder is responsible for allowing us to load or instantiate objects at runtime or during any time during our program's execution by using the resources.load method. So we're going to go ahead and create a folder, name it resources, and then we're going to create another folder. We're going to call this one graphics, because we're going to want a folder to store all of our graphics in. And then inside of the resources folder, just to keep things neat and organized, we're going to create another folder called prefabs. So this is completely unnecessary. You don't need to have a prefabs folder in the resources folder. You could just as easily throw all of your prefabs into the resources folder. But if you've got any other resources that you want to load using resources.load, then it might be better to have a folder structure there so that you can organize them better. I'm pretty much all about organization, and I think most programmers are. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to add all of the graphics to Unity that we're going to utilize in the game. And these are available to all of my patrons. Just head on over to my Patreon page and you can download these. Anybody else following along that isn't a patron, feel free to create your own graphics. These are all 64 by 64 PNGs, and if you just name them the same as I have them here, then you can follow along just as well with the tutorial here. But like I said, these are available on my Patreon page, so feel free to go there and check those out. So to continue on here, we've got all the graphics we need, numbers 1 through 8. We have the blank tile, which is, if there is no number or no mine. And then we've got these two. We've got this one, which covers all of the blocks until they're uncovered. And then we've got this one, which basically just, if we right-click, we want to put a flag, and that's kind of like a reminder for us to know that there's a flag. Then we've got the mine, obviously, and we've got the mine that's clicked. So if we accidentally click on a mine, then it shows us which one we clicked on by making the background red. And then we've got an X'd out mine, and that's basically if we mark a block as a flag and then we accidentally click on a mine, it'll show us which mine we clicked, and if we accidentally marked any of the other mines incorrectly, it'll uncover those and show us this. So a couple of things going on, so quite a few things we still have to code. So with that said, we've got our graphics. We actually have to make prefabs out of them, and the only one that I'm going to make a prefab out of right now. But before we do that, let me do one more thing, and that is we have to set the pixels per unit. Because we've got, right now, they're all at 100 pixels per unit, meaning that Unity allocates 100 pixels per 1 unit. So every X position and Y position is going to be 1 unit. So like 0, 0 is 100 by 100 pixels. And then 1, 0 would be x equals 1, y equals 0 still. That would mean that the next x position would then be at 100 instead of 0 because the pixels are 100. So this would make our tiles not line up correctly because our tiles are created at a 64 by 64 pixels. So with that, we would have an extra 36 pixels between each tile. So they would never line up properly. So we need to make sure that we set that. So we've got 64 pixels per tile. And keeping in the spirit of all the retro games that I've been setting up, we're going to set filter mode to point, so no filter, so that we don't have any aliasing, or sorry, anti-aliasing going on here. So we also want to do this to all the tiles, so I'm going to select all of these at once. And then we're going to go in and set the filter mode to point, no filter, and apply. All right. So now what we need to do is we need to create a prefab for the mine. We're only going to do it for the mine. And yeah, we're only going to do it for the mine. So we're going to drag the mine up here. So what that does is it actually creates a game object. So this is a sprite. This is a graphic, okay? And when you drag a sprite into a scene, because a sprite can't live on a scene by its own, it has to be part of a game object. What Unity does is it creates a game object, an empty game object, and it adds a sprite renderer component right here to that game object, and then sets the sprite property of that sprite renderer component equal to the image that you dragged up here. So there's a couple of things that happen when you drag a sprite into a scene. Okay, so since this created a game object for us, we can now take this game object and we can create a prefab from that game object. So, and we want to put that into our prefabs folder. So the way that you can create a prefab, one of the ways is to just take that from the scene and drag it down into the folder. You'll notice that that's now blue. That means it's a prefab. And it's also here. So any changes that we make to this prefab, okay, will be reflected to any of these living in the scene. So if we throw a mine here, another mine here, another mine here, and we change the location of all of these, let me just kind of fan these out so that you can see what I'm talking about here. All right. So we've got these mines out here. Now if I make a change to this prefab, such as the image, we'll change it to this, all of the game objects in the scene changed because they're all derived from this one prefab here, okay? And that's the power of prefabs, right? So let's change that back to what it's supposed to be. And let's delete these from the scene because we don't actually need them there. Okay, so we've got our one prefab called mine, and that's pretty much all we're going to need to get started. So let's go ahead and open up our game script again and look and see what we've got here. We are, from the very beginning, we're telling it, hey, we're going to create a game object, but it's just going to be empty. It's just going to be a game object, and it's going to just be empty. It's got nothing. So instead of doing that, let's create an actual game object that has something in it. So we're going to call create game object, okay, and we're going to call this mine tile, and we are going to use the instantiate method, and then we're going to use the resources.load method to get the first parameter of our instantiate method, which is the object that we want to instantiate. So resources.load takes two parameters. One is going to be the path. So that's going to be prefabs, because remember, resources.load starts in the resources directory. So the first directory that we need to traverse to is the prefabs. So then we just call the name of our prefab, which is mine. And then the second argument, we're just going to tell it what type of resource we're loading. So we're loading a, we're loading a game object. Okay. So then this parentheses closes the type of, this parentheses closes the resources.load, And then we just need to pass two more parameters. There are several overload methods here available to the instantiate method, but the way that we want to do it is we just want to give it a position where it's going to be. So we're going to tell it that we want it to be at the x and y that we generated, right? So we are going to use new vector 3, okay, because that's the kind of parameter that it's looking for, the type of parameter. And we're going to pass in x for x, y for y, and we're going to pass 0 for z, because we don't really care about z right now. The only other thing we need to give it is quaternion.identity, okay? And then we need to tell this whole thing that it's going to be instantiated as a game object, okay? So that the compiler doesn't complain. And then, last thing is we need to make sure that we assign MineTile to the location in the grid that we are actually placing the tile in, right? So now if we save that and go back to Unity and press play, hopefully, yep. So you'll see that some of these are out of the view of the camera, and this doesn't look very good, actually. If you look at the scene and you zoom out a little bit, you'll see that these are all off the camera, and that's because we are utilizing the actual positioning that Unity uses for the units. So like 1, 0, 1, 0, 0, 1, 0, 2, 0, 3, 0, 4, and so on, all the way throughout the grid. So we're going to go from 0 to 9 and 0 to 9 in both X and the Y direction. This camera is positioned from its center. So what we really need to do is we just need to drag this camera over so that its position is such that it is actually centered. And you know, you can kind of guess at this because eventually we're also going to add in like a background, like a border, to make this look like, you know, something. Right now, it just literally is just, you know, showing us the mines. And we may have an issue. Just realized something. So what do we have here? Let's do 2.75 and 4. Looks pretty good. So why doesn't this look the way it's supposed to? Crap. What was this again? 2.75 and 4. So these don't look right, do they? They look a little like we didn't. Well, there's 64. Oh, how about that? We didn't change them all. We only changed the first one. And that's what I was trying to tell you earlier, is with the space in between the tiles, because they're all set at 100. We never applied the change. So let's go in here and oops, change pixels per unit to 64, and then we also have the point no filter actually took. So now if we press play, they're pretty much lined up like they're supposed to be, except for the camera isn't where I'd like it to be. Because this tile right here is at 0, 0. So that's going to be the leftmost tile. So let's move this camera so that... What am I moving here? That's not it. Okay, so the camera somewhere maybe here, 4 and 4. Why does that sound good to me? So that means this one's probably at a 9 somewhere. X, no, that's x equals 8. So if we set x to 9, which it would technically never be, because there are 9 tiles and it starts at 0, so the furthest that x will go is 8. So that's pretty much in the center. So it's the camera's actual position is going to be 4 and 4, which makes sense in a way. So there's what the game is basically going to look like. Alright, so yeah, here we are. This is basically it for this part of the tutorial. The next part will probably cover maybe figuring out the mines, where they are, and then filling out the spaces and telling the, filling out the clue tiles to state how many mines are around the tile that we've uncovered. And I promise that'll make more sense in the next tutorial. So, if you guys enjoyed this tutorial, feel free to leave me a thumbs up. If you didn't, leave me a thumbs down. If you want to say something, leave it down below in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe, click on the bell for notifications, and that's pretty much it. So I'll see you guys next week.